Reenfleshing the Bright Boys, or How Male Bodies Matter to Feminist Theory, by Calvin Thomas. For hours each day the child Janae roosted in the silken peace of the outhouse, a confessional where we bare our intimate parts, feeding his imagination on the odor and darkness. For myself, it was many years before I could get near the poetry section in a bookstore or PS 3521 in library stacks without a sudden urge to shit, I don't know why, unless envy or emulation, a need, like a coyote's or hyena's, to set down my identity and scat. Galway Kinnell, holy shit. It is much harder for man to let the other come through him. Writing is the passageway, the entrance, the exit, the dwelling place of the other in me, the other that I am and am not, that I don't know how to be, but that I feel passing, that makes me live, that tears me apart, disturbs me, changes me. Who? A feminine one? A masculine one? Some? Helen Sisu, Sorties. I am one thing, my writing is another matter. Friedrich Nietzsche, Ecce Homo. The proliferation of masculinity studies has been viewed with understandable suspicion by some feminist theorists. Such studies are seen as integral to, if not responsible for, a critical and institutional shift away from a specifically feminist project and toward what is considered a politically neutralized gender studies. On this view, the argument that men are no less gendered than women, that masculinity is no less a social construction or performative masquerade than is femininity, is complicitous with the assumption that men and women are equally installed into symmetrically gendered positions. This assumption of equal or symmetrical gendering, supposedly inscribed in the phrase no less above, would obviously evacuate the feminist argument that the social and symbolic process of gendering sexed bodies maintains unequal and asymmetrical relations of power. Masculinity studies and the turn to gender are thus charged with perpetuating rather than interrogating the reproduction of male dominance. In some cases, charges such as these are justified. Some versions of men's studies, particularly those influenced by the mythopoetic school of Robert Bly, are spectacularly uninformed by and hostile to feminism, while even more well-intentioned interventions, based on the argument that the confines of normative masculinity are damaging to men, can seem perilously close to a whiny men have it bad too line of defensive reaction against feminism. They seem motivated by the desire to ameliorate the condition of men, while ignoring or minimizing the oppression of women. These sorts of masculinity studies can seem quite suspect, and their specific modes of reaction, appropriation, and celebration can seem to compromise the very possibility of pro-feminist masculinity studies by men. On the other hand, to leave masculinity unstudied, to proceed as if it were somehow not a form of gender, is to leave it naturalized, and thus to render it less permeable to change. For feminist theorists who recognize the importance of this fact, a gender studies that focuses on masculinity need not necessarily entail the depoliticization or betrayal of feminism. Quite to the contrary, it can also designate the critical process by which some men learn from feminism in order to make subversive interventions into reproductions of normative masculinity itself. There are a number of reasons and motivations for such intervention, and certainly the strategic point that normative masculinity harms men, that it can be in men's best interest, their most fully humanizing interests, to want to escape or demolish masculine norms, can be salutary. But from a specifically feminist perspective, interventions into masculinity, by feminist women and men, are not only desirable but necessary for one overarching reason. As Katja Silverman puts it, masculinity impinges with such force upon femininity that to effect a large-scale reconfiguration of male identification and desire would, at the very least, permit female subjectivity to be lived differently than it is at present. In terms of a masculinity studies whose point is change, the criticism most supportive of the feminist project, writes Tanya Modleski, is the kind that analyzes male power, male hegemony, with a concern for the effect of this power on the female subject, and with an awareness of how frequently male subjectivity works to appropriate femininity while oppressing women. For this male feminist, Silverman's and Modleski's points are crucial. What is ultimately at issue in masculinity studies is, or should be, the effect of masculinity construction on women. In other words, for a truly critical masculinity studies, the feminist project must remain what Frederick Jameson, in quite another context, calls the absolute horizon of all thought and all interpretation. Situated within this horizon, masculinity studies can be not the betrayal or appropriation of feminism, but rather one of its valuable and necessary consequences. But how best to study so as to transform the reproduction of the masculine in men? Perhaps the question, with its emphasis on competitively locating and inhabiting the superior mode of critical operation, is itself a bit too masculinist. My argument, which isn't necessarily the best, but simply the one I find most compelling, has been, and will continue to be, that one possibly productive way to analyze male power and hegemony, and to reconfigure male identification and desire, involves a specific sort of attention to the matter of the male body, and to the materialization of that body in writing. In writing as what Sisu calls the passageway, the entrance, the exit, the dwelling place of the other in me. Referring to my title then, I would say that male bodies do matter to feminist theory, and in two ways. First, in a simple sort of warm bodies appeal, I would argue for sheer numbers. The more pro-feminist men, straight and queer, the better for feminism. In this sense, male bodies matter to feminism because men, and sometimes do, materialize feminism in their writing, their teaching, and their public and private lives. Second, and more to my concerns here, I suggest the significance of the question of how the repression of the abject vulnerability of the male body, a repression necessary for the construction of heteronormative masculinity, demands a displacement of that vulnerability and all that it materially entails onto the feminine. Here is where the matter of writing emerges as a scene of visibility in which male subjectivity can be led to confront its effaced embodiment, its constitutive otherness, the femininity that has always functioned as the bearer of its meaning. Again, what is ultimately, but not always evidently, at issue in this confrontation is the effect on women of a specific sort of masculinity construction, a specific form of straight male anxiety assuagement. The question is not one of the way male authors represent themselves or women in their writing, but rather of writing itself as a bodily function, carrying the potential to alienate, to abject, to feminize, to demean, and even to queer, a heteromasculine subjectivity caught in the act of writing to itself. Readers of this essay who are familiar with my Male Matters will recognize these allusions to that book's central argument, about which I will have more to say here. Before doing so, however, I want to return to the institutional and methodological questions of feminism, gender studies, and masculinity with which I opened this essay. My context is a set of discussions by Judith Butler, her introductory essay Against Proper Objects, and her interviews with Rosie Braidotti and Gail Rubin in the 1994 More Gender Trouble, Feminism Meets Queer Theory issue of the feminist journal Differences. As the issue's title suggests, its central topic is not masculinity, but the tensions between feminism, gender studies, and queer theory. However, the relevance to masculinity studies, particularly to the question of the formation of masculine subjectivity through a defiling linguistic difference, will become evident as we proceed. Butler's immediate aim in Against Proper Objects is to counter the methodological and political boundary between feminism and gay lesbian studies that she sees being erected by the editors of the Routledge Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, both in their introduction and in their placement of Gail Rubin's Thinking Sex, which challenges feminism as the ultimate and complete account of the oppression of sexual minorities as the volume's lead essay. In the course of this discussion, Butler begins to examine the significant differences between feminists who make use of the category of gender and those who work within the framework of sexual difference. Roughly, the difference in framework involves the split between social constructionist approaches to the question of sexual identity and those influenced by Lacanian psychoanalysis. At issue is the question of the formation of the subject. Butler writes, "Those who work within the framework of sexual difference argue against gender on the grounds that it presupposes a notion of cultural construction in which the subject is taken as a given, and gender then acquires a supplementary meaning or role. Some would argue that such a view can recognize neither the way in which the workings of sexual difference in language establish the subject, nor the masculinity of that subject, and the exclusion of the feminine subject from subject formation that subject requires. Gender theory misunderstands the ways in which that asymmetrical relation between the sexes is installed through the primary workings of language, which presuppose the production of the unconscious. The turn to gender, for those who emerge from a Lacanian or post-Lacanian tradition, signals a papering over of this more fundamental structuring of language, intelligibility, and the production of the subject along the axis of a split which also produces the unconscious. Butler situates Rosie Braidotti as representative of this particular argument against gender. She writes that, according to Braidotti, some versions of the gender studies model consider the cultural construction of femininity and masculinity as homologous kinds of constructions, which suggests that the study of gender directly contradicts the political impetus of feminist analysis to mark the constitutive asymmetry of sex positions by which language and the unconscious emerge. For Braidotti, Butler writes, the turn to gender is understood as an anti-feminist move and a de-radicalization of the feminist political agenda. Gender is thus a sign of a politically diffused feminism, a framework which assumes the symmetrical positioning of men and women along the homologous means of their construction. Such diffusion, Butler writes, has even prompted the call "death to gender," offered not by Braidotti but by a feminist friend objecting to the replacement of a feminist perspective on sexual difference by a theory of the cultural or social construction of gender. In the subsequent interview with Braidotti, Feminism by Any Other Name, Butler draws Braidotti out on these points. Braidotti is indeed opposed not only to gender studies, basing her opposition on the realization of its politically disastrous institutional consequences, but to masculinity studies and gay male studies as well. Among the disasters Braidotti lists are the takeover of the feminist agenda by studies on masculinity, incidents of academic positions advertised as gender studies being given away to the bright boys, and the special significance of the role of the mainstream publisher Routledge in promoting gender as a way of de-radicalizing the feminist agenda, remarketing masculinity and gay male identity instead. In the course of comments such as these, Braidotti offers the following analysis. The focus on gender rather than sexual difference presumes that men and women are constituted in symmetrical ways, but this misses the feminist point about masculine dominance. In such a system, the masculine and the feminine are in a structurally dissymmetrical position. Men, as the empirical referent of the masculine, cannot be said to have a gender. Rather, they are expected to carry the phallus, which is something different. They are expected to exemplify abstract virility, which is hardly an easy task. Simone de Beauvoir observed 50 years ago that the price men pay for representing the universal is a loss of embodiment. The price women pay, on the other hand, is at once a loss of subjectivity and a confinement to the body. Men become disembodied and, through this process, gain entitlement to transcendence and subjectivity. Women become overembodied and thereby consigned to eminence. This results in two dissymmetrical positions and two opposing kind of problems. Several questions emerge from Braidotti's formulation. First of all, although it's a small concern, one might expect Braidotti to cite some particular examples of gender theorists who have missed the point about systemic male dominance. There are no specific citations other than the mention of Routledge, though I doubt that Braidotti would want to implicate everyone who has published in that mainstream as point missers, since the list would have to include Braidotti herself. More important, however, one might ask how we are to understand all of the expectations, entitlements, confinements, and consignments that Braidotti mentions here as not being gender. If we understand gendering not as a set of characteristics added on to a given pre-existing subjectivity, but as constitutive of the very social formation of any subject, as a social category imposed upon a sexed body, as the process of assuming, taking on, identifying with, the positionalities and meaning effects specified by a particular society's gender system, then it is difficult to understand the tropes Braidotti deploys as corresponding to or arising from anything other than a specifically socio-historical sex-gender system, particularly in regard to the expectation of phallus-carrying and abstract virility exemplification that Braidotti suggests exempts men from having a gender. It is difficult to understand where such expectations came from, if not society and culture, and if one responds, in supposedly good Lacanian fashion, that phallic expectations originate from the primary workings of language, which presuppose the production of the unconscious, then, since language and the unconscious don't just fall out of the sky, one still has to account, as Butler stresses, for the relationship between social production and linguistic production, between social structures and psychic structures, as well as for how their relationship might be reconfigured. Moreover, from a feminist perspective, one might want to account for the possibility of conditions under which men might productively fail to live up to phallic expectations or even consciously choose to betray them, a choice that would be something other than what Braidotti calls a self-regulating masculine agency. In other words, if, with Braidotti, we recognize the feminist value of an Irigarean double syntax that inscribes the difference not only of woman from man, but also of real-life women from the reified image of woman as other, can we not also ask about the feminist value of another syntactic doubling that opens up the difference between real-life men and the reified image or non-image of man as same, of man as bearer of the phallus? To begin to answer this question, I want briefly to consider the Lacanian take on linguistic difference as sexual difference, a take that supposedly supports the sexual difference framework to which Braidotti opposes the turn to gender. As Butler explains in her interview with Gail Rubin, Lacan's theory concerns the structure of language and the emergence of the speaking subject through sexual differentiation. There is, Butler writes, a Lacanian tendency to understand sexual difference as coextensive with language itself, so that there is no possibility of speaking, of taking a position in language, outside of differentiating moves. The primary differentiating move being that differentiation from the material, which is said to install a speaker in language for the first time. To unpack these comments, let's say that in Lacan's theory, what precedes the primary differentiation that installs us into positions of speaking subjects is the real. The real in Lacan is that pre-linguistic, undifferentiated realm of sensation and perception, without discernible subjective or corporeal locus, that characterizes our immediately post-uterine infantile existence, and that will always resist or exceed symbolization. Roughly, the real can be related to the oceanic feeling that Freud describes at the beginning of civilization and its discontents, and by Lacan, is directly related to the maternal body and what Jacqueline Rose calls undifferentiated space. For Freud, the development of the ego marks a separation from the oceanic feeling. The ego is what Freud strikingly calls a shrunken residue of that earlier, much larger field of sensation and perception. In Lacan's theory of ego development, we are shrink-wrapped, so to speak, into our subjectivities in two successive stages. The first instance of shrinkage is the mirror stage. The second our accession to the symbolic order of language. In the mirror stage, the infant's first misrecognition of its own image in the mirror is a moment of both jubilation, that's me, and alienation, that's me. This mixture of jubilant and alienating identification, méconnaissance, forecasts what Lacan calls the self's radical eccentricity to itself, and foregrounds the fact that the price of a fledgling subjective coherence will have been the irrecuperable expulsion from loss of the real. In other words, one begins to sense in the mirror stage that, by virtue of being one, being imagistically delineated as one isn't everything, isn't all. This loss of the all of the real is further ratified upon accession to the symbolic order of language, since language demands that one must differentiate from the real in order to signify the objects that now inadequately stand in for it. Or rather, one must have been separated from the objects of the real, say by paternal prohibition, the father's name and nom du père and nom de père, to be in the position of having to signify or symbolize them at all. Moreover, and importantly, since one must signify or symbolize oneself, one's own position as a subject of desire in the form of the first-person pronoun, the very positionality is objectified in the body of the sign, and a significatory self-alienation becomes the inevitable condition of being in language, being in the world. Lacan, following Saussure, defines the sign, and hence the world, as a presence made of absence. In other words, or in all words, the presence of the signifier presupposes the absence, or the possibility of the absence, not only of the referent, but of all the other signifiers that lend any particular signifier its value, language being, in Chausseur's sense, a differential system without positive terms. For Lacan, the defining and defiling characteristic of the symbolic is its capacity to murder the symbolized thing, to make present its absence, by the same significatory stroke that grants the world of things its very intelligibility. Thus, upon our accession to the symbolic order, there is born the world of meaning of a particular language in which the world of things will come to be arranged. It is the world of words that creates the world of things. Man speaks then, but it is because the symbol has made him man. Of course, the emphasis here on man and his symbol, or perhaps the symbol and its man, is not coincidental. Since the primary object of the real is for Lacan the maternal body, the primary differentiation from the real that language affects corresponds to the sexual difference between the male subject and the mother. This Lacanian imposition of sexual difference onto the primary differentiation of language has a number of consequences. Linguistic difference is metaphorized as sexual difference, which is itself figured as the difference between masculine being and feminine nothingness. The subject is presented with the question of his existence as an articulated question, what am I there, concerning his sex and his contingency in being, namely, that on the one hand, he is a man or a woman, and on the other, that he might not be, the two conjugating their mystery, and binding it in the symbols of procreation and death. The loss of the real that every subject suffers upon entry into language is metaphorized by Lacan in terms of the mother's lack of the phallus. Thus are we all castrated in and by the symbolic order. The mother's specific castration, and hence her putative desire for the phallus, is figured as the very essence of our general lack of being, and of our desire to mean, our desire to be viable and intelligible. The phallus, as signifier of lack, comes to symbolize the compensatory essence of symbolization itself, inscribing and necessitating our differentiation from the real, compensating us, always inadequately, for the very thing of which it deprives us. The phallus thus becomes the privileged term of union, by virtue of which our very desire to speak links up successfully with whatever meaning we manage to make. In other words, the Lacanian conflation of linguistic difference with sexual difference installs what Butler calls a heterosexual pathos, not merely into the mystery of physical procreation and or the death drive, but into the very process and possibility of successfully making sense. I repeat and scare quote the word successfully here, not only to foreground the way heteronormativity, and hence male dominance, subtends virtually all culturally legitimated forms of success or subjective viability, but also, conversely, to suggest the political productivity for certain kinds of men, of certain forms of embodied discursive failure, or desubjectivation. It is the productive possibility of anti-phallocentric, corporeo discursive failure that I want to keep in mind as we return to Butler and Braidotti's exchange regarding the sedimentations of heteronormativity in Lacan.